Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
Ever since my husband got his new job at the factory, our lives have revolved around his early morning schedule. He starts work at 4:45 a.m., and since we only have one car, I've had to adjust my entire routine. But honestly, I've grown to love these early mornings. I wake up at 3:30 a.m. to prepare his fresh lunch. It's my way of showing love and making sure he's well fed during his long shifts. After dropping him off, I usually head to this local grocery store that opens at 5 a.m. I've made friends with some of the staff there, especially this sweet lady who works the self-checkout. The store is peaceful at that hour. Just a few stockers going about their business, quiet aisles, and the gentle hum of the refrigerators. It's become my favorite time to shop. This morning I was wearing my yoga clothes, just some basic yoga pants and a white and gray tunic, since I planned to do my morning yoga routine once I got home. I needed to pick up a few items, including ketchup, so I headed to the condiments aisle. That's when this woman, let's call her Karen, started causing a scene over hot sauce. She loudly complained about the price of the hot sauce, practically shouting in the empty store. When I didn't respond and just smiled and shrugged, she got even more agitated, demanding to know why I was ignoring her. I tried to explain that I couldn't possibly ignore her since she was being so loud, and pointed out that I didn't work there since I wasn't wearing the blue and orange uniform like the actual employees. She wasn't having any of it though. She insisted she had seen me talking to the lady at the front, so I must work there. I explained that I was just a regular customer and friends with the employee, but Karen refused to believe me. She accused me of being off duty and demanded I explain the pricing to her. I tried reasoning with her, asking what explanation about the price would actually help her situation, but she just got more hostile, calling me a witch and demanding help. At this point, I told her once again that I couldn't help and asked her to leave me alone. That's when things really escalated. Her face turned bright red, and she suddenly rammed her cart into mine with such force that it hit my stomach. The impact tore my shirt and left me with scratches and bruises. I managed to push her cart away, but as I started heading to the front to get help, she began throwing my groceries onto the floor from my cart. Thankfully, my friend at the self-checkout had already heard the commotion and called the police. One of the stalkers, this big guy, must have been twice her size, came over to keep her away from me. But that just made her more aggressive. She started screaming at him, poking his chest, and throwing racial slurs his way. The poor guy just stood there, calm as could be, taking all her abuse. The police arrived about 15-20 minutes later, catching her in the middle of harassing the stalker. They immediately put her in handcuffs, and surprisingly, she calmed down, only to claim that I had assaulted her. The officers didn't buy it for a second. After reviewing the security footage and talking to witnesses, they arrested her on 2 counts of assault, vandalism, and larceny. Turns out she'd been stuffing items in her bag without paying. The hot sauce she was complaining about only cost $1.75. The police mentioned they suspected she was on drugs, though I never found out if that was confirmed. Later, I learned she was sentenced to community service and mandatory anger management classes. She also had to pay restitution for the damaged merchandise and my medical bills for the bruising. The store ended up banning her permanently, which means I can enjoy my peaceful early morning shopping without worrying about running into her again. The whole incident still baffles me. Who causes such a scene over $1.75 hot sauce when they're already stealing other items? I guess some questions just don't have logical answers. I've always been protective of my grandparents. They raised me after my parents passed away when I was young, and they're the only family I have left. They're in their 70s now, living in the same house they've owned for over 40 years. It's a peaceful neighborhood, or at least it was until they moved in. At first, everything seemed fine. The new neighbors, a husband, wife, and their 2 teenage kids, moved in about 8 months ago. The husband worked as a correctional officer and actually seemed pretty friendly initially. He'd chat with my grandfather when they were both outside, explaining his odd hours due to his work schedule. My grandmother even baked them a welcome pie, which the wife accepted with what we now know was fake gratitude. Things started going downhill when they went on vacation. They asked my grandfather to keep an eye on their house while they were gone, which he agreed to do because that's the kind of person he is, always willing to help. A few days into their vacation, he heard their dog crying in the backyard. When he looked over the fence, he found the poor thing tied up on a short lead, with no water in sight. The dog was clearly distressed, and my grandfather couldn't just ignore it. When my grandfather called me about the situation, he explained what he'd found. I told him to call animal control right away, since it was clearly a case of neglect. He did exactly that, and animal control came to rescue the dog. That's when everything went to hell. When they got back from vacation, the husband showed up at my grandparents' door like a raging bull. He was pounding so hard I'm surprised he didn't break it down. When my grandfather opened the door, the husband immediately started hurling insults at him. He called my grandfather every vile name imaginable and threatened to hurt him if he ever caught him alone outside. His wife wasn't any better, standing in their yard and screaming threats about making my grandparents pay for what they'd done. The teenagers were standing in their driveway, smirking and filming everything on their phones. It was disgusting. That was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, my grandparents' house became a target. One night, someone dragged the community dumpster from the back alley and threw it into their pool. Their back patio got pelted with eggs multiple times. The final straw was when a grapefruit came crashing through their window. We called the police every single time, but they were useless. The officers just kept telling us that without catching someone in the act, there was nothing they could do. No proof meant no case, according to them. I'd had enough. My grandparents were living in fear, jumping at every sound. I started making calls to the correctional facility where the husband worked. When I finally got through to the warden, he said he'd look into it. A few days later, the husband showed up again, even more enraged. He was back to pounding on the door, this time yelling about how we'd tried to mess with his job. He threatened both me and my grandfather, saying we'd regret what we'd done. This time I was there, and I had my phone recording everything. When I went outside to confront him, he backed off slightly, saying he wouldn't hit me because he didn't want to lose his job, but he kept making threats as he walked away, telling us both to watch our backs. I sent the video straight to the warden. A week later, 2 investigators from the Associate Director of Corrections showed up at my grandparents' house. We told them everything. The dog incident, the vandalism, the threats, everything. I showed them the video, and we provided all the police reports we'd filed. Turns out this wasn't the first time he'd had issues. He'd been transferred to our area because of problems at his previous facility. It was either transfer or be fired. Well, this time he got fired. Their house went into foreclosure, and we got an order of protection against them. One night they just disappeared, packed up and left in the middle of the night like the cowards they were. Good riddance to that jerk, his nasty wife, who never missed a chance to curse at my grandfather, and their 2 brats who thought vandalizing an elderly couple's home was entertainment. The new neighbors who moved in afterward are amazing people. They own a local restaurant and regularly bring food to my grandparents. It's like the universe was making up for putting us through hell with those others. My grandparents can finally enjoy their backyard again without worrying about what might come flying over the fence next. A little over a year ago, I landed my dream job as an electrician. The pay was fantastic at $25 per hour, the benefits were great, and I was learning so much. My boss, who owned this family-run business, was one of the best people I'd ever worked for. He always praised good work and was understanding when personal matters came up. I rarely asked for a time off, but when I did, there was never an issue. Everything was perfect. Then we hired this new guy. Let's just say he was the epitome of toxic masculinity. A huge, muscular guy who thought he was God's gift to manhood. He was a type who believed there was only one way to be a real man, and if you didn't fit his narrow definition, you were less than nothing. If you wore safety gloves, he'd mock you for being soft. scared of spiders. He'd wave them in your face and call you a baby. Every single day he found new ways to belittle the other guys on site, but I got the worst of it. Everything I did seemed to trigger him into a verbal assault. One time, when I suggested we should double check our electrical connections before powering up, he called me a princess and mocked me for not being confident enough to get it right the first time, saying that real men don't need to double check their work. I tried reporting him to my boss, but this guy was clever. When confronted, he'd act completely innocent and tell the boss he was just trying to toughen me up for the industry, claiming it was all just harmless fun. Somehow, he had convinced a few co-workers to back up his version of events. After months of this treatment, I had enough. I wanted payback, and thankfully, this guy's biggest weakness was his own ego. He loved to brag, especially about things he should have kept to himself. That's how I learned about his insurance scam. One day, he was bragging about how his parents used to spoil him. They bought him a car in his early 20s and fully insured it against everything: theft, fire, vandalism, you name it. But apparently, the car wasn't good enough for him. When his parents refused to get him a better one, he took matters into his own hands. He reported the car stolen, and 3 days later it turned up burned out in some back lot. The insurance company paid out, and he used that money to buy the car he actually wanted. He even had the nerve to brag about how stupid the insurance company was for never catching him. That's when I knew exactly how to get my revenge. I let one of my co-workers in on my plan. We'd get him to confess on tape and send it to both the police and the insurance company. I bought a small recording device and waited for the right moment. One day at work, I started telling my co-worker about how I used to steal candy as a kid. Just as I hoped, he couldn't resist one-upping my story. He immediately jumped in to brag about how he had pulled one over on the insurance company. He proceeded to spill every detail of his insurance scam. To seal the deal, I asked him to confirm if he really got away with insurance fraud. With complete arrogance, he bragged about being smarter than he looked. That night, I converted the recording to an audio file and used a burner email to send copies to the police and his insurance company. 3 days later, he didn't show up for work, or the next day, or the day after that. We eventually found out he'd been arrested at his home. The company put him on unpaid leave. Technically not fired, but he wasn't getting any money, so it might as well have been the same thing. The workplace atmosphere completely changed after he left. Everyone seemed happier, more relaxed, and we actually started enjoying our jobs again. My wife and I had just bought our first house before having kids, and we were those annoying new homeowners who took immense pride in their yard. You know the type. Spending way too much money on fancy gardening tools and obsessing over every blade of grass. All those years of being forced to do yard work as a kid finally paid off, I guess. We'd spend our weekends comparing different types of fertilizers and debating the perfect grass length with the excitement of people who clearly didn't have enough hobbies. The trouble started with this utility box in our yard. It belonged to this massive cable company that consistently ranks as one of America's most hated businesses. And boy, did they earn that title. One day, I came home to find the box wide open, cables sprawled everywhere like someone had gutted it. I figured some technician was on break and would be back to clean up. The next day, still a mess. So I called the cable company. I politely explained about the open utility box and exposed cables in my yard. The customer service representative assured me they would have someone out the next day to finish the work. Their tone was that practiced kind of niceness that, isn't going to translate into actual action. Weeks passed. Nothing changed. We were planning our first pool party, and having this eyesore in our perfectly maintained yard was driving me crazy. My wife kept pointing out how the exposed cables were ruining the aesthetic of her carefully planned flower bed. I called again. This time, when I explained about the utility box being left open for weeks, the representative dismissively told me they would get to it eventually, and hung up on me. Not even a pretense of customer service this time. That's when the fun started. During our pool party, after a few margaritas, my friends and I got to talking about the situation. Most of us were engineers except for one friend who drove trucks for a living. We started poking around the utility box, and what we discovered was pretty interesting. They didn't use any security measures, just simple cable connections, probably because nobody ever thought to mess with them here in the Midwest. It was almost laughable how basic their setup was. Our truck driver friend pointed out that only one house on the block even had cable service. Another engineer friend caught his drift immediately, and we all exchanged knowing looks. The combination of tequila, technical knowledge, and righteous indignation proved to be dangerously effective. Between the margaritas and our collective spite toward this company, we hatched a plan. We ended up hooking up 7 houses to free cable service, each connection made with the precise care that only tipsy engineers could provide. That's when our truck driver friend's knowledge really came in handy. He explained about the special padlocks they use in trucking, pulling out this massive round lock from his truck. He told us they use these specific locks because they're impossible to cut with regular bolt cutters, sharing stories about attempted cargo thefts that were thwarted by these simple but effective devices. The gleam in his eye as he held up that lock told us all we needed to know. The padlock hole was too small, but that's what power tools are for. One of the engineers ran home for his drill, excitedly explaining the metallurgical properties of the utility box's locking mechanism. After a quick modification, we locked up our handiwork with industrial-grade security. Over the next few weeks, I quietly let my neighbors know about our little rebellion. Everyone was more than happy to join in. One elderly neighbor even baked me a cake as a thank you. Months later, 2 cable company technicians showed up. I watched them from my window as they studied the padlock like it was some alien technology. I could hear them wondering aloud about what kind of lock it was. Clearly nothing they'd encountered before. They tried their standard bolt cutters with no luck, their confusion growing with each failed attempt. My wife and I pretended to garden while watching their increasingly frustrated efforts. After a few minutes of struggling, they just exchanged defeated looks, shrugged, and left. That was the last we saw of them for years. My neighbors and I would occasionally catch each other's eyes when passing by the utility box, sharing secret smiles of victory. The free cable party lasted for over 4 years. We saved recordings of every rude customer service call we got from them, playing them at neighborhood barbecues to much laughter. What finally ended it? The one neighbor who actually paid for cable service moved out. The new technician who came to disconnect their service was apparently more dedicated than his predecessors. It took him 3 separate visits with increasingly larger bolt cutters. The final one was over 4 feet long, but he finally got through our industrial lock. We watched from our windows as he struggled, almost impressed by his determination. But you know what? Those 4 years of free cable for 7 households felt like perfect karma for their terrible customer service. By my calculations, that one rude phone call cost them roughly $40,000 in lost revenue. My engineer friends still talk about it at gatherings, analyzing how a little knowledge of locks and cables, combined with terrible customer service, led to what we now call the Great Cable Uprising. Sometimes being eventually isn't good enough, especially when you're dealing with a group of bored engineers and one very knowledgeable truck driver. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.